Okay, juniors, this will serve as our lecture over the fourth section of Chapter 21, focusing on the Cold War still. And in this section, we'll talk more about the presidential administration of Dwight Eisenhower, the famous World War II general who goes on to become the 34th President of the United States, being elected in 1952, taking office in 1953. So to start with, again, by the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed bigger, stronger bombs known as the hydrogen bomb, the H bomb, which was much more powerful than the atomic weapons that were used on Japan during World War II. So, again, we're kind of locked in this arms race really in the 1950s going into the 1960s and beyond. But with these stronger arms being developed, the other thing that happens, and to us it might be kind of comical now, is there was widespread I guess, distribution of air raid drills and what you should do in the event that you are caught in a place that's being hit by an atomic weapon. So if you click on this, the YouTube link here, I'm not going to play it for you guys as a part of this right now, but if you click on that link later or go to that link, you can view an air raid drill or a bombing drill, a government production here from the early 1950s. That's kind of interesting, and you can let me know your thoughts on that maybe later as you view that. But something to keep in mind here during the administration of Eisenhower is we are locked in this arms race. Bigger, stronger nuclear weapons are being developed by the United States and by the Soviet Union. So again, talking a little bit more about Eisenhower. Again, Eisenhower was a military guy, right? He had been a general of the Allied forces during World War II, and that's where he's going to gain a lot of his, a lot of his popularity with the American people would be a good way of saying it. And as far as his policies towards the Soviet Union, again, it was the policy of containment, and the idea that he was understanding that both sides had developed these H bombs, and the fact that if hydrogen bombs were ever used on one side or the other or both or someplace else, that was basically guaranteed mutually assured destruction, that life would essentially it would cease to exist in those places that were attacked. So keeping that in mind, and really his plan was to focus, as far as containment, was to focus on building up the U.S. military and specifically our Air Force and our technology with bombing. So what you see happen during Eisenhower's administration is that the military becomes more well-funded, but the Army and the Navy will receive a little bit less funding. Their funding actually gets cut. The Air Force gets more, so we can develop different spy planes and things like that. So we'll talk more about that here in a little bit too. But the idea of Eisenhower was the idea of brinkmanship, that we had to build up bigger and faster than the Soviet Union and just be ready for that, and that our counterattack to the Soviet Union, if they were to bomb us, would need to be more powerful than theirs. So that's something to keep in mind here with Eisenhower as far as just focusing on his policies towards the Soviet Union, towards communism. There's going to be a number of instances during his presidency where Eisenhower is going to use the CIA, right, our Central Intelligence Agency. He's going to use the CIA to do some things in the Middle East and in Africa and Central America to try to suppress, suspected communist uprisings. There's a really well-known one in Iran where the United States did not really care for the man in charge there, and so the United States more or less kind of staged a revolt, paid some Iranian rebels to revolt, and that also freed up the control of the oil business in Iran too. So interesting. There's also some things that he did involving Guatemala, a country in Central America, where the United States again also provided aid to anti-communist rebels to ensure that Guatemala did not become communist. So there's a couple of examples there, but really a focus on the military and developing a bigger and stronger military, specifically an Air Force, with Eisenhower. Now, the other thing that Eisenhower is well known for during this Cold War era is the issuing of his Eisenhower Doctrine. So like Truman had a doctrine, Eisenhower also had a doctrine, right? It was kind of the club that the presidents were joining. And whereas Truman's doctrine focused on places like Greece and Turkey, Eisenhower's is going to focus specifically on the Middle East. And this is a big reason, juniors, why the United States, really since the 1950s, has had a major presence in the Middle East. And what this doctrine said is that the United States would defend any Middle Eastern country against a communist attack. And so a part of this and why this came up was a lot of it involved the Suez Canal that I'm sure Mr. Norman talked to you about in world history. So kind of going out of order here and talking about the Suez crisis first. Again, the Suez, is the Suez Canal runs between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, right? And it runs right through Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. So understanding that what had happened is countries like Britain and France that had, pretty much operated this canal. What's going to happen is the man in charge of Egypt, his name was Nasser. What Nasser's going to do is he's trying to kind of get more money from both the United States and from the Soviet Union. He would kind of play them against each other in a way where, he was trying to get more money for Egypt so they could, do a variety of things. But eventually what had happened is that the United States found out he was also taking loans for Egypt from the Soviet Union. So the United States withdrew their funding to Egypt. Nasser gets really mad. He's going to block access to the use of the canal to France and Britain. France and Britain are going to send warships. Now, what's interesting about this, and then Israel gets pulled into it too because of Israel and the way it was created and some of the religious aspects there. But the other thing too is what's interesting is we talk about instances where the Soviet Union and the United States ever agreed, and the one thing that they did agree on is that the Suez Canal needed to be open, Israel needed to be left alone, and that going to war, that Britain and France like using military tactics to fight Egypt, that wasn't going to work either. So eventually what does happen is the United Nations is going to step in. The United Nations is going to step in, and eventually what's going to happen is they're going to reopen the canal. But the other thing about this is with the way the Soviet Union, helped with this process, because again, it's one of the few things the United States and the Soviet Union ever agreed on, especially during this era, is what's going to happen is the Soviet Union becomes very popular amongst Middle Eastern nations. And so because the Soviet Union had become popular during this Suez crisis with the way it was aiding Egypt, right, in the eyes of the Egyptian people and the Middle Eastern people, that leads to the issuing of the Eisenhower Doctrine. And again, that is still a major reason why the United States is tied up in the Middle East today. So keep that in mind. The other big thing that happens here during Eisenhower's presidency is the U-2 incident. And this is, again, another kind of example of heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. So Joseph Stalin had died. I want to say it was 1953 or 1954. Stalin had passed away. And so the guy that replaced him, his name was Khrushchev. And we'll hear a lot about Khrushchev here throughout the remainder of the chapter. But Nikita Khrushchev takes over as the Soviet premier, I guess, or the Soviet chairman of the Communist Party, however you want to call him. And what's going to happen is Eisenhower is going to work to really try to mend some things, right? And the one thing that Eisenhower offered is because, again, there was a total lack of trust. There was a total lack of trust between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so the one idea that Eisenhower had pitched to Khrushchev was to, quote unquote, allow for an open skies policy. And essentially what that meant was that the United States would allow the Soviets to fly high altitude spy planes, unarmed, right? Unarmed Soviet spy planes over the United States so they could see what we were doing. In return, the Soviet Union would allow the United States to do the same thing. And this, again, was Eisenhower's pitch to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev said, nope, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm not in favor of doing that. Even if it's a way to kind of try to build some trust. Okay, and Eisenhower, okay, kind of backs off on it for a little bit. Nonetheless, the United States continued to produce these U-2 planes, and again, a U-2 plane is a high altitude flying plane that can take pictures, and at the time it was allegedly supposed to be undiscoverable to radar and things like that. So nonetheless, though, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, his name was John Foster Dulles. He kind of encourages, and that was the other thing here too about Eisenhower's presidency, especially with things going on with Cold War and Soviet Union, is his Secretary of State Dulles kind of got him to do a lot of things. And so the one thing that Dulles got Eisenhower to do was to okay U-2 flights. So the United States, starting in the spring of 1960, starting in that, at the start of the decade, the United States started flying these planes over the Soviet Union anyways, and taking pictures of troop movements and where they were making weapons and things like that. And so Eisenhower's like, we really probably shouldn't be doing this. We're going to get caught with our hands in the cookie jar almost kind of attitude. And Dulles actually, Eisenhower's ready to discontinue the program. Like, this is a bad idea. This is going to bring all sorts of bad things. And Dulles talks him into one more mission. And on that last mission in May of 1960, and this was in May 1st, 1960, what happens is the U-2 plane, U.S. U-2 plane, gets shot down about 1,200 miles inside the Soviet borders. The pilot's name was Francis Powers. Francis Powers had to parachute out of his plane so that he didn't crash and burn and pass away. He gets captured by the Soviets. He's in prison for 17 months. Eventually, he says, yep, I was flying a spy plane. We were taking pictures. And eventually, the United States will kind of do an exchange where Francis Powers comes home. The United States sends a Soviet spy back to the Soviet Union. But Eisenhower would not admit right away that this was a spy plane. Instead he said it was a weather plane that got off track or something like that. But after Powers had said, yeah, I was spying for the United States, Eisenhower kind of came out and said, yeah, I'm lying. And that was something that maybe where Eisenhower had taken some steps to mend relationships with the Soviet Union. That was something that really it just kind of, I guess, built more tension going into the 1960s, where we'll probably see of all the decades, probably see the most tension, or most of the well-documented tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The other thing I wanted to mention here too is going back to Eisenhower and talking more about the buildup of the military. The other thing that Eisenhower, at the end of his second term, so this is in 1961, right towards the end of his second term, is Eisenhower issues kind of like a warning to the United States. Like, Eisenhower had thought that, that military spending and really like military manufacturing had kind of gotten out of control, and that was too it was too large of a part of our economy, of our production and that sort of thing for our country. And so he started warning the United States about this military-industrial complex, that if we just based our economy off military production, that was something that was going to hurt the economy later. Nonetheless, the military is still one of our most well-funded, or the most well-funded portion of our entire government. But it was something that he had warned about. And what's interesting, as the Cold War goes on, is that warning kind of gets just tossed aside, because you're going to see more and more military technology and buildup and development really throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and obviously into today. So just talking a little bit more about those things. If you have questions, please shoot me an email. You guys have a